Well, I'd like to invite you to turn in your Bibles, like Pastor John said, to Hebrews chapter 2 this morning. If you're using one of the Bibles that's provided for you in a seat rack in front of you, it's page number 1001. 1001. Well, this is our last service before Christmas. It's our Christmas service. And it's an opportunity for us to highlight the magnificence of Christ. With all the glitter and glitz of this season, I hope that you can quiet your heart right now and think about Jesus. That's why we've gathered this morning. What I'd like to do is I'd like to pray and ask for the Lord's blessing as we look into His Word and take these next moments to think about Christ in our hearts. Lord, we give thanks that we can gather and worship You. I even think about that last song, and that we would fall on our knees, that we would rejoice, that even this Christmas season, we would see You as King, and that You would rule and reign on the throne of our hearts. This morning, we ask that You would take away any distraction. We ask that You would quiet our hearts. We ask that You would balm our pain and help us to see Jesus. It's in His name we pray. Amen. Well, the whole book of Hebrews is actually a wonderful book. I mean, the whole Bible's wonderful. But I just want to tell you, there are some books of the Bible that stir your heart towards Christ, and Hebrews is one of them. You get to the end of your Bible, you're like, the book of Revelation, Jesus is going to reign and rule as King of all. You get to the book of Hebrews, you see Jesus is the promised Messiah. He's the one that people looked for thousands of years. Jesus is Lord. That's what you find through the pages of the book of Hebrews. The whole book focuses on his majesty, His preeminence, His superiority, His ascendancy, His incomparability, His splendor, His magnificence. It focuses on all that. And if I could think of a few more adjectives, I'd throw them in there right now. Because the book of Hebrews it elevates Christ. It says, He's the one you should be looking for. He's the one you should be looking at. And at this time of year, perhaps more than ever, we need to look to Christ. When you fold through the pages of this book, what you find is that Jesus' glory beams from every page. His supremacy is whispered on nearly every line. And it's almost as if the author of this book is using these chapters to argue one single point. Now, he approaches it from all different angles, but it's as if he wants to build this single case that's irrefutable. And it's this. He wants you to come to the conclusion that Jesus is better. I mean, he's better than anything. He's better than everything. He's better than anyone. He's better than everyone. Jesus is better. And that's the argument he builds as he goes through the chapters of this book. I mean, he's better than the prophets, the author of Hebrews will argue, because Jesus is the apex of revelation. That's found in Hebrews 1 and 2. He's a better servant than Moses. I mean, think about, this book was written to Jews. That's why it's entitled Hebrews. But think about their greatest prophet, Moses, who gave them the Torah, gave them the law. The author of Hebrews says this, but wait, there's a better prophet than Moses. It's Jesus. Because he's not like the servant Moses. He's a faithful son. And you find that in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. You find that Jesus grants a better rest than Joshua in Hebrews chapter 4. He institutes a better covenant than the one at Sinai in Hebrews chapter 8. You see, he offers a better sacrifice. Jesus offers a better sacrifice than the blood of bulls and goats because he offers himself as the once for all sacrifice, the final, sufficient, ultimate sacrifice for the sins of mankind. A better sacrifice, a better covenant, a better prophet, a better rest, a better high priest. He's a better high priest than any high priest Israel has ever known. He doesn't get old and slow and have to retire. No, this high priest offers one sacrifice, namely himself, and he sits down at the right hand of God because it's finished. He ever lives. This is what the author of Hebrews says. Jesus is a better high priest than any high priest in all of Israel's history because Jesus, as our high priest, ever lives to make intercession for transgressors like us. You don't need any other priest. I'm just telling you, you don't need a priest, a pastor, a prophet, a pope. You don't need any of those. You've got one. It's Jesus. And he is the one mediator between God and man. And he ever lives. He's always living to make intercession for people like us. So at the end of the day, the author of Hebrews just wants you to catch this. Jesus is better. Now, at this juncture, I've been arguing that Jesus is better, just like the author of Hebrews has. But there might be someone who listens to the argument so far, and they think to themselves, well, all of these comparisons, Lukus, that you're making, that you're saying are here in this book, all of these comparisons are with earthly points of reference. In other words, okay, Jesus is better than Moses, Jesus is better than Joshua, Jesus is better than a high priest, Jesus is better than other prophets. Okay. But maybe that's like comparing a Yankees all-star with someone from a little league team. I mean, maybe that's like comparing Babe Ruth or Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio with like 7-year-old Johnny who plays across the street. You say, yeah, Babe Ruth is better than Johnny. Babe Ruth is better than Ryan in 4th grade. Babe Ruth is better than Tyler. He's a little small for his age. Some of you might be wondering, are these comparisons with Jesus and the prophets, Jesus and these other priests, are these comparisons really equal? I mean, what if we compared Jesus with other heavenly beings? In other words, what if we leveled the playing field just a little bit? How does Jesus rival heavenly beings? Say, I don't know, like angels, for instance. How does Jesus rival angels? Well, the author of Hebrews actually has an answer for that. As we trace the opening of this book, we discover that Jesus is even better than angels. And the reason is because he's the Son of God. And if you look at the opening of the book of Hebrews, like flip back one page to Hebrews chapter 1, I just want to show you a few verses here. He's going to say that Jesus is better than angels because he has a greater name. Look at Hebrews 1, verse 4. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son"? See, Jesus is better than the angels because he actually has a greater name. You keep tracing through Hebrews chapter 1, you get to verse 6, and you see that Jesus is better than angels because Jesus receives worship from the angels. You see in verse number 8 that Jesus is better than the angels because he's a king who rules and reigns, whereas the angels are merely servants and ministers. You see that in verses 13 and 14. At the end of the day, the author of Hebrews wants you to know that Jesus is better than angels because Jesus came to do something that no angel could ever do. Jesus came to accomplish a task that he was uniquely suited to accomplish. No angel could do it. No animal could do it. No other person could do it. It would require the Son of God to take on flesh, it would require the incarnation. Jesus was going to accomplish something that no angel, animal, or other person could do, and he was going to do it as the incarnate Son of God. So what I'd like to do today as we approach Christmas is I'd like to submit to you that the incarnation was necessary to accomplish the work of God that no one else could do. The incarnation was necessary for a number of reasons. The Son of God had to take on flesh. It was necessary for a number of reasons. And here's the first one. The incarnation was necessary to fulfill God's original intention for humanity. The Son of God had to take on flesh in order to fulfill what God initially intended for mankind. Let me see if I can explain myself from Hebrews chapter 2, verse number 5. Take a look at that. Hebrews chapter 2, verse number 5. For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere. It's funny, the author, it's been testified somewhere. If you want to write in parentheses, put Psalm 8. It's been testified in Psalm 8. It's been testified somewhere. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. The incarnation was necessary to fulfill God's original intention for humanity. In Hebrews chapter 2, the author is appealing to Psalm 8, the quotation there, where he says, it has been testified somewhere. He's quoting Psalm 8. It's been testified in Psalm 8. And so he's appealing to Psalm 8, which is a psalm that celebrates the majesty of God. But not only that, it also celebrates the exalted position of humans in the midst of God's creative purposes. So in other words, as the crown of creation, that's where mankind is. And so Psalm 8 celebrates that. But what we realize is that this exalted position of mankind, man made in the image of God, man crowned with glory and honor. Do you see that in verse 7? God designed man to be crowned with glory and honor. God designed man as made in the image of himself. But that did not last. God's original design is that humans would be made in his image, that they'd be crowned with glory and honor, that they would exercise dominion as vice regents. In other words, if you take your mind all the way back to creation in Genesis 3, you have to realize that God designed humanity to image him in all of the world. So we're made in his image, to image him in all of the world and express dominion as vice regents across all of his creation. That's how God designed, that's how God intended humanity to exist. What you see there is that from the beginning, everything was supposed to be in submission or subjection to man. Look at verse number 8. When man was made, he was crowned with glory and honor, verse number 8, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Go back to the early pages of Genesis, and you'll find mankind there, and all the animals and all the trees and all the stuff was supposed to be in subjection to mankind. Man was told to go and have dominion over all of the earth. That's God's original intention for humanity. That was his original design. Display his image in all the earth, have dominion over all creation. God's original design, and that's what Psalm 8 describes. But what we realize is that 3 pages into our Bible, by Genesis chapter 3, sin enters into the world, and it ruins everything. Sin comes and it twists things. It mars the image of God. It pollutes glory and honor. No longer would creation be subjected to humanity. What we find by the time we get to Genesis chapter 3 is that instead of glory and honor crowning man, and instead of all of creation being in subjection to him, instead, in pain, progeny would enter the earth. Ask any woman in here who's given birth. In pain, progeny would be born into the earth. Thorns and thistles would resist any attempt to tame the ground. It would require the sweat of man's brow to wrestle against the earth. Cries of agony is what children would hear as they'd be born into this world. God's design was polluted. His creation was corrupted. So by the time we get to verse number 8, look at verse number 8 here. It says, now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside of his control. But because of sin, look at the rest of verse 8. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him. Look around the world, my friends. This Christmas, pause and look around the world. Is all of the earth in subjection to man? Does humanity exist? I mean, total humanity. Does total humanity exist to image forth God in this world? Is humanity crowned with glory and honor? I mean, that's God's original design, but I want to submit to you that actually sin twisted all of that. It corrupted all of that. It ruined all that. And then all of a sudden we get to verse number 8 and it says, so that's why we don't see it right now. Because sin twisted those things. The cry of agony, the pain of toil, the sweat of the brow. That's how we exist in this cursed world. That's why we need the incarnation. What you need to realize is that the incarnation actually changes everything. We were supposed to image forth God in this world, but we did a poor job at it, didn't we? We sinned, marred the image. So we needed someone who would perfectly image forth God. Look at Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Look at Hebrews 1:3. It's talking about Jesus, the Son of God. He is the radiance of the glory of God. Remember, man was supposed to be crowned with glory and honor, but we didn't do a very good job. Sin twisted and corrupted all that. But then Jesus came. The incarnation happened. Then one came who was the radiance of the glory of God. Look at this. The exact imprint of his nature. The perfect image of God. The perfect express imprint. If you had a ring that had a seal and it was to press into some hot wax, the exact imprint of God was Jesus. The one who perfectly imaged God. The one who expressed dominion over all things. Have you ever traced through the gospel the life of Jesus and noticed how he expressed dominion over this broken, cursed earth? Pause for a second. How do you know this earth is broken and cursed? Well, just turn on the news. Look at natural disasters. Look at ruin. Look at crime. Look at death. Look at all of these things. And then Jesus breaks into time and space. The incarnation occurs. And he is the express image. He is perfectly imaging God to all of this world. And he is expressing dominion over all that. How did he do that? Well, he sees a cripple and he makes him whole. He sees a leper riddled with disease and he cleanses him. He sees a dead person named Lazarus and raises him from the dead. He sees a storm and he says, "Peace be still." The incarnation was reversing the curse. The Son of God took on flesh so that he could actually be the fullness of humanity that we were designed to be before sin. Why do we need the incarnation? Because we need someone who would do what we couldn't do. We need someone who would fulfill God's intended design for humanity, and that is to have dominion over the world and to display the image of God perfectly. Even though God's design was marred by sin, his plan would not be thwarted. the failure and corruption that were brought about by the disobedience of the first Adam would actually be overturned by the righteousness and obedience of the last Adam. Where death and corruption were brought as a consequence of the first Adam's sin, life and righteousness would be brought as a consequence of the second Adam's life, death, and resurrection. The rule promised to humanity was forfeited by the first Adam. It was restored by the last. The image of God that was marred in the beginning was renewed in Jesus. And so what we find this Christmas is that the incarnation was necessary. It was necessary to fulfill God's original intention for humanity. But not only that, let me tell you a second thing. The incarnation was necessary to bring many sons to glory. The incarnation was necessary to bring many sons to glory. You see that in Hebrews chapter 2, verse number 10. I want you to see, as I read this, I'm going to read verses 10 through 15. I want you to see that what he's going to do is there's going to be this powerful Son of God who's going to, see, we were on this trajectory towards death and destruction because of our sin, but this Son of God was going to give us a new trajectory. He was going to be the way, the truth, and the life, and he was going to bring many sons of Adam and daughters of Eve to glory. Look at verse 10. It was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given to me. Since therefore the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. The incarnation was necessary to bring many sons to glory. What we see in these 5 verses is that the Son had to become man so that he could be the leader of redemption. He could be the deliverer from slavery. You see in our text in verse number 10, he's called the founder or the archegon of our salvation. The imagery in the book of Hebrews is interesting. It seems that there's an allusion to this right here. There's interesting imagery of the Exodus. The first Exodus, God redeemed his people. He delivered his people from slavery to Egypt. But in the next Exodus, he would deliver people from the slavery to death. That's what you see at the end of our section that we were just looking at there. It says that, verse number 15, and he would deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. He was going to institute, the Son was going to take on flesh so that he could become the founder or the leader or the deliverer of our salvation and lead a new exodus, lead people not out of slavery from Egypt, but out of slavery to death. He would lead people out of slavery to death. And the way that he would do that is he would die in their place. That's what you see in verse number 9. He would taste death. Verse number 9, taste death for everyone. That's how he would lead his people to glory. He would taste death on their behalf. Now, I want you to pause for a second and think about this. Romans says this, wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. So death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. Right? So trace all the way back to the beginning and watch Adam and Eve sin in the garden, and the consequence of that was what? It was death. Right? So all of humanity, because of sin, is on this pathway, this broad pathway to destruction. But what we see taking place here is that a leader has come to lead us on a different pathway, a pathway to life. He's leading us on a new exodus out of bondage to death to a place of life everlasting. But in order to do that, he'd have to take sinners like us and he'd have to cleanse us. Because he can't just leave people who are bound in sin, people who are in bondage and in slavery to sin, and just lead them in continued slavery to sin, to glory. He couldn't do that. He'd have to break the bonds of sin. He'd have to undo the shackles and slavery to transgression before he'd lead us to glory. He'd have to cleanse us, wash us. He'd have to sanctify us. That's what the text says here. The Son of God became man. Verse number 11, so that he could sanctify us. Take a look at verse number 11. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. In order for him to sanctify us, I want to say this. On one hand, he had to be like us. And on another hand, he had to be unlike us. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to teach us. On the one hand, he had to be like us in the sense that he had to be human. He had to be, the text calls us, he had to be a brother. Someone who was made flesh and blood. He had to be like us. But then he also had to be unlike us. He had to be pure and spotless. He had to be someone who, even though he was tempted like we are, it says in 4:15, yet without what? Without sin. He had to be without sin. And so the Son of God took on flesh, Jesus, so that he could be like us, human, unlike us, pure and spotless, but could be our leader, our deliverer to salvation. It was fitting that the Son would take on himself humanity and suffer for us. I love that word in verse number 10. It was fitting. I just paused and reflected on that when I was studying this week. It was fitting. What does that mean? It wasn't fair. I don't want anyone to think here that it was fair for the Son of God to condescend and become humanity, the perfect man, to live amongst us as a slave and a servant, and then to die on a cross. That, my friends, was not fair. But what the author of Hebrews says is it was fitting. The glass slipper of this redemption would only fit on one person, the Son of God who took on flesh. It was fitting. It wasn't fair, but it was fitting. And he filled that role. He took on that task. Jesus' suffering and crucifixion. It was not the failed end to the incarnation. It was the precise purpose of the incarnation. It was the means. I mean, as this passage unfolds, you find it was the means by which he would, look at verse number 14. It was the means by which he would destroy the one who has the power of death. That is the devil. He would be the serpent crusher. The incarnation was the means by which that would happen. It was the means by which he would deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. The incarnation was the means for that to be happening. All of the planned and promised glory and honor that was designed for humanity had been derailed by sin and death. Satan, that cruel taskmaster, had tempted and tormented humanity. He had wooed humanity into rebellion. He had laughed all of us into the grave until Jesus came. Suddenly, the Son of God takes on flesh, and like Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 says, he crushes the serpent's head. He destroyed this sinister taskmaster. He offered deliverance from the cage of fear and doom. The incarnation breaks the chains of death and provides a means by which Jesus can bring many sons and daughters to glory. Verse number 10. This is why we need the incarnation. This is why we need the enfleshment of the Son of God. This is why we celebrate Christmas. The incarnation was necessary to fulfill God's original intention for humanity, to bring many sons to glory. And finally, it was necessary so that we could have a merciful and faithful high priest. When you think about Christmas, I want you to think of the incarnation And I want you to know that it was necessary so that we could have a merciful and faithful high priest. Look at the last verses of the chapter. For surely it was not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become, he says, a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation. That's a big, long theological word that simply means this: to make a sufficient payment. To make a sufficient payment for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when he tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. The incarnation was necessary so that we could have a merciful and faithful high priest. The Son had to have a human nature that corresponds to ours so that he could be merciful, so that he could be faithful, so that he could offer a sacrifice that propitiated, that sufficiently paid for the sins of the people. He had to assume humanity so that he could cure humanity. The fathers, the church fathers, they would write this: he could not redeem what he did not assume. And so he assumed humanity so that he could redeem humanity, so that he could be the merciful and faithful high priest that we need. So he took on humanity in every respect, verse 17, obviously except for sin. It means this: it means he understands our vulnerabilities. He understands our weaknesses. He understands our condition. It means he knows what it feels like to have a tear run down your cheek. He understands loss. He knows betrayal. He knows what it's like to be severely tempted. He understands it. That's what it says here. For because he has suffered when tempted, he knows that. And that's why he's so merciful with us. That's why he's our merciful high priest. He can sympathize with us in our weakness. He can stand next to us in our temptation. The incarnation made him a merciful high priest. This man of sorrows who's acquainted with grief stands next to you in yours. And he's merciful. Not only that, he's faithful. He's faithful. What would it take to be a faithful high priest? And I just want to suggest this. If a high priest is going to be faithful, one thing he would need to do is he would need to offer an appropriate sacrifice. See, what do you mean by that? Well, imagine if you came to the temple and you were supposed to offer a sacrifice that required an ox, and instead he offers a turtle dove. Not a faithful high priest. What if you came to the temple and you were supposed to offer a slain lamb, but instead the high priest pours wine and throws some cornmeal up in the air? Not a faithful high priest. We needed a high priest who would offer the right sacrifice, the type of sacrifice that could propitiate, that could expiate, that could fully pay for what we needed. We needed a high priest that was faithful like that. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And so our high priest, our faithful and merciful high priest, he stood and he offered the right sacrifice. He offered himself, a once for all full payment that satisfied sin's debt. Jesus offered himself for you and me. Friends, the Son of God took on flesh. He embraced the incarnation so that he could fulfill God's original intention for mankind, to display the image of God, to have dominion. The incarnation is something he embraced so that he could bring many sons of Adam and daughters of Eve to glory. And he would do that by being our merciful and faithful high priest. So this Christmas season, Christ, the Son of God incarnate, is the greatest gift you can ever receive. So I wonder, if you're here this morning, I wonder if you would just receive the gift of Christ incarnate. God so loved the world that he did what? He gave. He gave his only begotten Son. the incarnation, so that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. Will you receive him? And if you already have, will you rejoice in him this Christmas? Let's pray.